Good morning, good Catholic. The writer John McGahern once wrote that Ireland was a peculiar place in the sense that it was a 19th century society right up until the mid-1970s, and then it almost bypassed the 20th century. As you're asked to celebrate and reflect upon Europe Day here in the National Parliament, that quote above all captures for me the pace of change that occurred in Irish society after we joined the European Union in 1973. I am, and members of my party are, members of my generation, we're proud Europeans, we're Irish and we are European. The EU has its faults, and I intend to address those here in some detail, but I do believe it important to begin by expressing that the EU on a whole has been a force of good, both for Ireland as a driver of economic and societal change, and for the continent above all else as a binder of peace following the global conflicts that predated its existence. That peace now once more being threatened by violent despotism we all hoped had been rendered to the 20th century. Membership of the European Union has very clearly changed Ireland. We joined almost 50 years on from achieving independence from the United Kingdom, and as we did, I'd argue we are still a nation struggling for identity. A society that social conservatism was forced upon as a form of jingoistic patriotism. A state which in turn abandoned vital public services in health, education, in care and in welfare so that citizens were reliant upon the Catholic Church to provide what a state ought to. An economy that was overly agrarian, protectionist and lacking in confidence. In December 1972, 84% of the people of this country voted to remove the special place afforded to the Catholic Church in their constitution. Earlier that year, and on this date 50 years ago, almost an identical percentage of our population had voted for Ireland to join what was then the European Economic Community. It would be very clear to be wrong. It would be very wrong to point at that year. It would be very wrong to point to that year, or indeed to those referendums as a moment upon which Ireland threw off its cloak of conservatism, either on social or indeed economic grounds. But the various struggles for LGBTQI+, reproductive or even the right to divorce can testify to that. But that was for me an important moment where the Irish people were very clear in the determination of a new course and to be outward looking and to the point of being part of a collective bigger than ourselves. The Taoiseach touched on this point earlier in his speech when he said that membership gave us the impetus needed to strengthen our own human rights record, to drive forward civil and social rights, to introduce gender equality legislation, to improve protection of workers' rights and to become a much more tolerant, kinder and inclusive country than Ireland had been to that point. I also like to highlight the role of civic society played in driving that forward, but we shouldn't in any way undermine the role the EU did and give us that confidence. And I think it's a really important point that actually Ireland in 1972 was a much darker place than it is today. And I think that gives us the legitimacy to point to the type of rule of law issues that we were dealing with in the European Union this year before the invasion of the Ukraine, last year before the invasion of the Ukraine. And we should not be afraid to challenge those who do not meet those standards, be they friend or foes. And I'm particularly pointing to the horrific sequence of LGBT exclusion zones that existed in Poland, for example, and the exclusion of members of the community, the banning of literature. All of those are still very much prevalent, and we shouldn't forget about them, nor should we shy away from confronting people and confronting those and holding them to a standard that we accept. And there are rule of law mechanisms that we do need to go back to. And we should approach at zero tolerance when discrimination abounds in the European Union or even amongst our friends who wish to join us. It would be remiss of me not to talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and important to reflect upon the fact that as missiles rain down on Ukrainian towns and cities and peoples, one of their calls being made most loud from Ukraine is to become a member of the European Union. And it's to our credit and to the Irish state's credit that we are most vocal in supporting those calls. But what is to be the legacy of those collective response to that most horrific attack by the forces of Putin on the people of Ukraine? This too will pass, it's been mentioned, and we need to be there to support the rebuilding of Ukrainian cities and to welcome into the European Union. But we also need to look at the factors which contributed to the Russian state being able to engage in this horrendous assault on Ukraine. And we need to reflect on how we remove ourselves from dependencies, not only on the fossil fuel extraction which has fuelled this war. And we can't simply say that these sanctions and our unwillingness now to engage with the Russian Federation were simply going to go off and engage in undemocratic regimes elsewhere, be they in the Saudi Arabia or in South America. We have to remove ourselves from fossil fuel extraction. We hear much about the militarisation of the EU, and we must oppose that in every single way. But in wars past, we've seen great increases in industrialisation, and there needs to be a new form of green impetus where fossil fuel extraction has to be gone and we need to invest in solar, in wind and if necessary in wave, and that's going to remove ourselves entirely from these despotisms that are funded by this type of fossil fuel extraction. I'm also very conscious, and I only have a minute left so I'll be very quick, of another threat that faces the European Union, and that's when you talk about the European Union, Ireland's role there, we're often told that the first point on the score is that Ireland's membership of the European Union has given us access to a market of 440 million people. The EU has to be much more than a market-based economy. It absolutely has to be. In Europe at the moment, 96.5 million people are living in or at risk of poverty. That, for me, is a massive threat to the European Union. And to give evidence to that, I often point to a place just across the water from us at the town of Holyhead in Anglesey in Wales, which was statistically and is still, I believe, the poorest part of the United Kingdom. And as we approach the six-year point of the referendum on Brexit, that part, which was totally reliant upon exports coming from Ireland and going to the EU, voted to leave. They have an average economy, an average household economy there of just under €14,000, totally dependent upon exports into the EU before they left, and they still voted to leave. Poverty, if people are not feeling the benefit and the warmth of EU membership, well, they will remove themselves from it. Poverty is something that isn't often discussed within the European Union. I believe we can be leaders in terms of confronting it. We can no longer have situations where anti-poverty strategies are brought forward every 5 years and simply left on the shelf to rot, because that, amongst other things, is a huge threat to the very foundations of the European Union. Good morning, Carlock.